Joining us now on the line from Boston, Massachusetts, Francis Fukuyama, the author of The Origins of Political Order. He's a senior fellow at Stanford University and, of course, the author once upon a time, way back in 1989, of that seminal essay, The End of History. Dr. Fukuyama, it's great to have you here on TVO again. How are you tonight?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. Your book's subtitle, which I didn't say then, but I will say now, is From Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution, which kind of takes us back quite a long way, all the way back to the chimpanzees. So I want to start by asking you this. Why do you think it's necessary to go all the way that far back to get a better understanding of modern politics?
Well, I think the reason is that there's such a thing as human biology. We are not individualists by nature. We're actually social creatures, and in the primates that were the ancestors of human beings, you already see very human-like political behavior. So modern chimpanzees, who we presume are like the progenitors of humans, organize themselves into gangs. They conduct warfare. They raid each other. They have hierarchies. They have leaders. And so I think that there's a great continuity, actually, between those progenitors of human beings and the kind of early behaviors that you see in hunter-gatherer societies. So that's really the foundation. If you don't realize that all human beings have a kind of universal nature, you're not going to understand why you get these recurrent patterns across cultures in the way that human politics works.
Okay, let me follow up the analogy one more time then. You've also written that humans are rule-following animals. And I wonder what it is about making rules and following them that serves our survival.
Well, rules are the basis of social cooperation. If we didn't have a rule that we all drive on the right side of the street, we'd get into automobile accidents. And when you think about an army or a bureaucracy or any kind of big social enterprise, it's all a matter of rules. And so, and the thing about rules is that they're really, in a sense, genetically, they're not there by nature, but the faculty for making and following rules is there by nature. You know, a child, when he disobeys the rules of his little play group, gets incredibly embarrassed. And you see that this is not a learned behavior. This is something that is just born. You know, all children are born with this kind of faculty.
Let me do an excerpt here from your book, and this is about tribal leadership in Papua New Guinea, of all places. Here we go. No one is born a quote-unquote big man, nor can a big man hand that title down to his son. Rather, the position has to be earned in each generation. It falls not necessarily to those who are physically dominant, but to those who have earned the community's trust, usually on the ability to distribute pigs, shell money, and other resources to members of the tribe. Without resources to distribute, he loses his status as leader. Now, I don't mean this to sound like a facetious follow-up question, but what's the difference between that and a president whose leadership qualities seem to be, if not in doubt, then at least questioned, because the price of gasoline in your country is up around $4 a gallon now?
Well, you know, quite frankly, there isn't that much of a difference. The politician distributing resources to followers is a universal phenomenon. It exists in Canada, it exists in the U.S. Congress, and I think it's a kind of natural mode of political behavior, that you vote for me and I give you something of value. You know, modern politics is not quite supposed to work that way. We're supposed to vote on issues. We're not supposed to just vote according to our narrow private interest, but in a way that's a violation of our natures, because in fact our social relationships are all built around favoring friends and family over strangers to us. And so that's, in a way, kind of one of the great struggles of creating a modern political order, is to get past this big man kind of politics, which we would default to in the absence of incentives to hire people with qualifications and have clean bureaucracies and the like.
I wonder if that, though, speaks to an impossibility for us to see the better nature in all of us, or I guess what Abraham Lincoln used to call the better angels in all of us. Are we incapable of, therefore, doing that?
Well, one of the tragic things about human history is, yes, we are capable of doing that, but it really takes an extreme incentive, and unfortunately in human history that incentive has often been war. Abraham Lincoln is actually a great example of that, because at that period in American politics, most of the federal appointees were patronage appointments. Every office seeker, came to Abraham Lincoln and said he wanted to be a postmaster or a general, and in fact, the Union side, the federal side in the Civil War, lost a number of key battles because Lincoln hired an incompetent political appointee, and it was only by the end of the Civil War that he realized that if he didn't get someone like Grant, who was actually a great soldier and promoted on the basis of merit, that his side was going to lose the war. And I think you see this everywhere. In ancient China, China builds the first modern state that is impersonal and not based just on friends and family. And they do this because they fight a whole series, literally hundreds of wars over a 500-year period. And that's what drives the formation of basic political institutions.
Well, that's interesting, because I suspect most of us in our elementary school days learned that the cradle of democracy really begins in ancient Greece. But are you telling us that in some respects we have more to learn from China than from Greece?
Well, it's true that the Greeks had democracy. The Chinese never had democracy up until the present moment. What the Chinese had that the Greeks didn't have was a modern state. The Chinese in 221 BC unified their country, and they ruled it on the basis of an authoritarian, centralized, bureaucratic system where they invented the civil service exam, so that in order to become a Chinese bureaucrat, you had to pass certain qualifying exams, and they ruled over an enormous empire, which at the time of Jesus Christ was about 60 million people, about the size of the Roman Empire. But they did this in a much more uniform, centralized, rule-bound way than anyone in the Mediterranean, in the ancient Mediterranean world. And it's something I don't think they get adequate credit for. And it's actually a great continuity in their history, because that's still the kind of political system they have today.
I was just going to say, I mean, on the one hand, you're praising them for having established that so long ago, but on the other hand, nothing's changed. They're still not big on freedom, are they?
Well, that's right. So in my view, there's actually three important types of political institutions that a modern society needs. So one is the state itself. That's this ability to concentrate power, and that part of it the Chinese got way earlier than anyone in Europe. But another important set of institutions is the rule of law, which are rules that govern the ruler himself. The emperor has to bend to the law if you're going to have a real rule of law. And the Chinese never had that. The Chinese never had that, I think, because they really never had a transcendental religion that could be the source of these rules. And then finally, the Chinese never developed institutions of accountability where the ruler was answerable to his people for his performance. And so if you have just the strong state but no rule of law and no accountability, what you have is a pretty good dictatorship. And that's been the character of Chinese government for the last 2 millennia.
Let me follow up on that then. If people love freedom, and we think that they do, and if they love making money, which I think most people do, and if they need the security of living in a place that follows the rule of law, and they want their governments to be accountable, which seem like fairly universal concepts, can you assume that democracy was inevitable?
I don't think that you can ever assume the inevitability of any of these institutions. And in fact, in my book, I have a whole section on the rise of accountable government, of democracy. And it turns out it's actually kind of an accident. It is due to the survival of a peculiar feudal institution, which in England was called a parliament, in France was called a sovereign court, in Spain was called the Cortes, in Poland was called the Diet. These were assemblies of notables. Medieval kings had to go to them to get taxation. As Europe modernized, all of them were dismantled or run roughshod over by these increasingly powerful kings, except in one country, England, where the parliament was sufficiently cohesive that it could actually stand up to a king and wage a civil war with him, eventually cut off his head. This was Charles I. And then depose a second king, James II, and establish the principle of parliamentary government. And it only happened in England. It didn't happen in France or Spain or Russia or any other part of the world. And so I think, absent the specific historical conditions that the English faced, you wouldn't have gotten parliamentary government. And, Canada may today be ruled by a more Chinese-style autocrat had that not happened.
You know, there are so many good jokes that I think some of our viewers who don't particularly care for the current prime minister, who would like to fill in the blank there, but I'm just going to let that go and move it along. I will follow up on that again in a second, but while we're kind of here, religion. I want to ask you about how religion, what contribution you think religion has made to the making of political order over the years.
Well, you know, religions, especially since September 11th, has gotten a really bad rap from people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who see it just as a source of extremism and fanaticism and division. But in fact, I think historically, religion has played an extremely important role as a source of political order, because it's what allows people to get beyond the family. In Arabia in the 7th century, the Arabian tribes were disunited, couldn't do anything, were marginal in the history of that region until the rise of Islam. And Islam basically told them, you're members of a larger Muslim religious community, you're not just tribesmen. And all of a sudden they burst into the historical, scene, conquered most of the Mediterranean world, because religion was like the social glue that held them together. And I think it continues to do that. That's the basis of common culture that makes for nations and social coherence.
You ever had a debate with Hitchens or Dawkins about this?
Well, I know what they say. And I think that, the thing about our modern world is that because of globalization, immigration, the pluralism of modern societies, we have all these religions that are all butted up against each other. We have religious minorities, and in that kind of a world, religion does become a source of division, because there's a lot of different religions that have incompatible doctrines. But I think in most societies, they actually had just a single religion, usually supported by the state historically, and that was actually more of a source of social cohesion.
Okay, here's the follow-up question then that I promised a few minutes ago on that trinity, if you like, of ideas that you put forward: the state, the rule of law, accountable governments, and so on. Do you believe that the people who were demonstrating in Tahrir Square some months ago in Cairo, who wanted more freedom, who wanted more democratic values, who wanted the right to have a more fair and efficient economy, who wanted an accountable government, do you think they were trying to import Western political concepts?
We don't really know the answer to that. I am pretty sure that a lot of the better educated young people, all the ones that were on Twitter and Facebook organizing those demonstrations, probably do want something that looks pretty much like Western liberal democracy. They were joined by a lot of other people, trade unionists that just wanted better wages, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist group that is a very questionable allegiance to democratic values, and others. And so I think it was done for a mixture of motives, and I think now the central problem is that the two social groups in Egypt that are the best organized are the army and the Muslim Brotherhood. And all of the ones that are more Western in outlook and want something that we would recognize as liberal democracy have a lot of passion, and there may be actually a lot of them, but they don't have a political party, they don't have a leader, and they're going to have to work really hard in order to prevent either the army or the Muslim Brotherhood from taking over.
Okay, but I guess I'm wondering whether or not you feel, once again, that holy trinity, freedom, rule of law, accountable government, whether they, are those universal ideas that belong to the world at large?
I don't think that they are, well, they're certainly not universal. In a sense, my book tries to explain that you can have those three things in any combination. You can have a state without rule of law and without democracy, which is China. You can have a weak state with accountability, which is a lot of, let's say, Latin America, and so forth. And so you don't have the Holy Trinity in many societies, and that's actually one of the great problems in political development, and one of the reasons why every country is not Denmark or the United States. They work together well as a whole, because that's what's the basis of a modern capitalist order, and that's what gets you rich. But actually getting there is a really complicated historical process that requires war, conflict, creating national identities, higher levels of education. So, compared to, I think, where I was 20 years ago when I wrote the original end of history, I have a much greater appreciation for the difficulty of building the right, that right combination of institutions, and it's not something you can ever assume will just happen like, water a plant and it automatically grows into an adult of the species.
No, fair enough, but let me try one more on this because admittedly we're in the realm of speculation here, but okay, the people in Libya, the people in Syria who are doing so much fighting and dying these days, are they doing that because they want what we have or because they want a more efficient and competent leadership as they have in China?
I don't think they want to imitate China, but the problem with Syria and Libya and Yemen and Jordan and a lot of other countries in that region is that they are divided by ethnicity, by religion, by tribe, and it could be that some of the conflicts we're seeing are actually not the way we would like to portray them as, good democrats versus bad authoritarians. It may just be actually one tribe or one ethnic group or one religious sect that doesn't like the fact that they're being oppressed by another tribe or ethnic group or religious sect. In Syria, for example, the Syrian government has been based on this Alawite sect for the last couple of generations. It represents only 3-4% of the Syrian population, and people have been smarting under this for a long time. And so, do they want democracy? I'm sure that there are many Syrians that are absolutely sincere in wanting what we would recognize as democracy, but that's not the only factor that's driving the conflict there.
You know David Brooks from the New York Times?
Yes, I do. He's a friend of mine.
I thought he was, which is why I'm going to quote him to you. Here's what he had in the New York Times on April 21st of this year. Americans have lost faith in the credibility of their political system, which is the one resource the entire regime is predicated upon. This loss of faith has contributed to a complex but dark national mood. The country is anxious, pessimistic, ashamed, helpless, and defensive. Okay, what do you think of what your friend David has to say?
I would agree with most of this. I think that this financial crisis and all of the stuff that's happened in the past decade has really dented American optimism and self-confidence, and for good reasons. I think that Americans traditionally have been pragmatic, willing to work together to come up with solutions to problems. We've got a really big problem right now in the long-term sustainability of our fiscal deficit and so forth, and it's theoretically solvable, but the society, I think, is so divided and angry and polarized that nobody gives it much, the political system, much credit for being able to get past these current divisions. And I think that's really the source of the pessimism right now. It's not a very functional political system.
In which case, how would you explain what I mean, even we here in Canada see it, the absolutely deepening polarization and partisanship in, it seems like, all Western democracies today?
Well, it's hard to know. I think you're right that this is part of a broader phenomenon. Part of it is media driven. I think that people get to talk to people that agree with each other. They're not forced to deliberate. I think that over time you accumulate kind of ideological positions, and you're not really willing to be flexible when conditions change. I think, for example, the Republican Party in the United States got this idea under Reagan that you should never, ever, ever raise taxes. And that might have been, a good slogan in the early 1980s when tax rates were genuinely through the roof. But if you're ever going to close a budget deficit, you can't stick rigidly to this kind of a position. But I don't see any Republican right now that's willing to do that. So I think over time, this is one of the sources of political decay that in my book I talk about in the context of other societies. People tend to these rigidities in outlook, in institutions, and they don't recognize that the situation around them has changed. And when that happens, then the whole system becomes dysfunctional. It
does seem as if there's a kind of a vicious circle among the political classes and the media classes, if you like, I guess what Sarah Palin would call the lamestream media nowadays, in as much as they seem to kind of get off emphasizing this notion that there's a zealotry out there that both sides have that no one can get past. And beyond that, it's really quite entertaining on television in prime time. Who's got a vested interest in breaking this thing down? Because it certainly seems to me like there's a vested interest in keeping it going.
I think, unfortunately, you're right. If you had a group of experts who sat around a table having a calm discussion about tax policy or energy policy, everybody would fall asleep. But if they're all getting, vicious and personal, people will watch that sort of thing. And, it spills over into people's relation. And the other thing in the United States that's going on is that people are segregating themselves by their political views and where they live and in what parts of the country they choose to settle. And so, you're arriving at a society, in a sense, that really doesn't have to deal with disagreement on a personal face-to-face basis.
Although I thought in 2008, when Barack Obama won a few what are normally thought of as red states, that might be breaking down, that big shift might be breaking down. But you say it's alive and well.
Well, I think actually Barack Obama got into office not because those divisions were breaking down. I think he profited from an anti-George W. Bush vote. And he was put over the top by a lot of independents and centrists who normally wouldn't, maybe vote for a left-wing Democrat, but they disliked Bush so much that they were willing to take a chance on him. But it doesn't lead to a consensus, and now we've got the Tea Party. He thought that there's going to be this generation-long shift to the left, but instead the big new source of populism is right-wing, and go figure, given the financial crisis and everything else. But that's where we've ended up.
Mm-hmm. In our last 2 or 3 minutes here, let me come full circle on you and once again ask you to kind of get back into our biology and help us understand this. Do you think we as a species, almost biologically speaking, have a need to create political conflict?
We are a very proud species. One philosopher said we're the beast with red cheeks, so that when we come up with a theory of how things work, whether it's a religious theory or supply-side economics or Marxism or anything, we don't just regard this as a theory that may or may not work and we'll see how it happens. We invest it with intrinsic meaning, and that I think is really a deep biological characteristic, and that means that it imparts a certain stability to our institutions, but it also means that if you don't recognize the value of my gods or practices or ways of life, it's not just that you're a little different from me, it means that you've fundamentally disrespected things that are sacred or holy to me. And I do think that that is a really important cause of most of the conflicts that we see. They're conflicts over identity and over the recognition of who we are as a people. In terms of the dignity of our very ideas.
So just finally, as you look at cultures and societies around the world, would you say that conflict between us and them, however you want to define that, is a constant in human nature?
Well, I think that violence and conflict have been around for as long as there have been human beings. One of the great achievements, I think, of modernization is that there's actually less conflict now than there was in the Middle Ages. There was less conflict in the Middle Ages than there was in hunter-gatherer times. And so our institutions are, gradually, I think, producing greater levels of peace. But the problem is that the potential for conflict is there, and there's some social problems that ultimately don't get solved except through conflict. And so, unfortunately, given technology, when the conflict breaks out, it's a lot more deadly than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. I suspect we could stand a little more peace. What do you think?
Yeah, but you have to, in a way, step back from that a little bit. During the Cold War, which wasn't that long ago, you had these two big superpowers that were armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And I remember as a kid, once there was a thunderclap, and I thought, okay, the nuclear war has started. We were worried about, losing tens of millions of people in a nuclear holocaust. And I think the chance now of a large-scale war between big industrialized states is actually pretty small. So I do think that, you know, in certain ways, things are not as bad as they may seem at first.
Fair point, and a good optimistic place to leave things. Francis Fukuyama, author of The Origins of Political Order. So good of you to join us on the line from Boston tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.